going on, you guys? Welcome back to another video. In this video, I'm going to be replacing the oil filter housing gasket on my 2014 BMW 335i with the N55 engine. As in typical BMW fashion, that gasket is leaking, along with some other gaskets that are on the car that I'll be getting to later. But in this video, I'm just going to be focusing on the oil filter housing gasket and the oil cooler gasket. It is leaking towards the bottom right side of the housing, next to the large coolant hose, and starting to drip down to the belt and to the tensioner. So that is why we are going to be replacing this gasket. So let's just get right into it. So the first thing I did here was remove the engine cover and remove the air intake. To remove the engine cover, you just pull up and it'll pop out pretty easily. To remove the air intake, you just simply loosen this little clamp here with a flathead screwdriver. And then you have to squeeze this little rubber piece here to get it through this little hole. And then you have to disconnect the mass airflow sensor connection and then the little vent hose right next to it. Lastly, you just unlatch these clips around the air filter box and it should just pop right out. After I removed the top section of the air intake, I put a cloth inside the lower section so that nothing falls inside while I'm working on the car. The next thing I did here was remove this little clip that's holding the oil cooler lines together. It's held on by a 10mm bolt. Next, I removed this little hose that's held on by these two clamps right on top of the radiator fan. Now getting into the disassembly of the oil filter housing, I used a T30 Torx bit to remove the T30 bolt that's holding the oil cooler lines to the oil cooler. Next, you're going to want to create your own little catch can to catch any fluids that most likely will spill out when you disconnect all of these hoses. Before you disconnect the oil cooler lines, place your little catch can below them so that it'll catch any oil that spills out when you disconnect it. Once you disconnect the oil cooler lines, you're going to want to place and secure them out of the way. For me, I kind of struggled a bit to keep them out of the way, so you may notice they keep coming back in place as I continue taking the oil filter housing off. Now you can take an E12 Torx socket to remove the E12 bolts that are securing the oil cooler to the oil filter housing. There are 3 bolts. There's 2 on the top that are easily visible and then 1 on the bottom underneath that go right behind where the oil cooler lines connect to the oil cooler. Once you get all the bolts out, you can use a flathead screwdriver to insert in between the oil cooler and the oil filter housing so that you can push the oil cooler off of the oil filter housing. Again, have your catch can ready because more oil will spill out once you disconnect the oil cooler. Next, I decided to remove the lower coolant hose that's below the oil filter housing, because it was kind of in the way of the lower bolt that we needed to remove to get the oil filter housing out. It's held on by a coolant flange that has 2 10mm bolts that you have to remove. And again, have your little catch can ready because coolant will spill out once you remove this hose. Depending how many miles your car has, this little coolant hose flange may break as you're removing it. Mine did, so I ended up having to order a new coolant hose flange. This is a common thing to happen on pretty much all BMWs. This happened on my E90 as well. So just be prepared for that if you do have to remove this little coolant hose. Now to remove the oil filter housing, there are 3 bolts you have to remove. There's one on the top that's really easy to remove, then the other 2 are a bit more difficult. There's one underneath back behind the intake manifold and one on the lower part of the oil filter housing that's kind of in an awkward position. So in order to get the one bolt that's behind the intake manifold, you're going to have to remove the intake manifold and move it a little bit out of the way. You don't have to take it completely out, but you do have to wiggle it around to make some space so that you can fit a socket and an extension in there so you can unsecure that bolt. To be able to move the intake manifold around, you're going to have to remove 7 10mm bolts and nuts. There are 4 bolts and I believe 3 nuts towards the back of the engine bay side of the intake manifold. When you're removing the nuts in the back, just be careful not to drop them because they are small. I actually ended up dropping one down the engine bay and I had to order some new ones. And to get the very last nut in the back of the engine bay on the intake manifold, you're going to have to use some sort of swivel joint because it is in a pretty tight spot. Once you get all the bolts out, you can disconnect the 2 wire connections that run along the intake manifold towards the top of the engine so that you can create more room for the intake manifold to move around. Once you create enough room to insert the socket and the extension, you can use your E12 torque socket to remove the E12 bolt behind the intake manifold. Once you've completely unscrewed the bolt, be very careful when you are removing it so that you do not drop it down back behind the intake manifold. Next, I remove the bolt that is on the top of the oil filter housing. To remove the last bolt that was next to the coolant hose flange that I removed earlier, I used a E12 Torx wrench to break that bolt free, and then I used an E12 Torx socket to completely unscrew it out of the oil filter housing. Now after I removed the oil filter housing, I attempted to remove the last coolant hose, which is the large hose, as you can see still connected to the housing. I realized that it was not coming off, so I had to force it off and break it off. Because of the constant heating and cooling, it just kind of ruined its ability to just be removed. So I had to force it off, which required me to break off the plastic connection that connects it to the housing, and I ended up just having to order a completely new hose. Once I got the housing off, I was then able to remove the old gasket with a little pick tool. The gasket was kind of stuck on there just from the constant heating and cooling of the engine for both the oil filter housing gasket and the oil cooler gasket. Once I got the gaskets out, I cleaned both the oil filter housing and the oil cooler with some brake cleaner to remove any oil or dirt that may have been stuck on there. After I cleaned them, I inserted the new gaskets. So I ended up needing to wait to finish this job because I realized that this hose is really not in good shape because of the oil leak that was underneath there. I also accidentally broke this hose, which goes to the coolant reservoir, and this little flange here broke off when I pulled it out to drain the coolant, and half of it is stuck in there. So I ordered a new hose and a new flange and another new hose here for this hose. For this flange, it's a common issue on BMWs since it's made out of plastic for it to just break off like this. So they have aluminum ones that you could put in place of this plastic one that won't break. So that's what I did. I ordered a new aluminum one. So now I'm going to finish the job. To install the new aluminum flange, I just cut off part of the hose that was wrapped around the old flange. Once the new aluminum flange was inserted all the way into the hose, I tightened down the new hose clamp with a flathead screwdriver. Once the new aluminum flange was inserted into the engine, I just used the same two 10mm bolts to secure it to the engine. After replacing the damaged coolant hoses and the coolant flange, I began securing the oil filter housing back in place. When you're securing the oil filter housing back onto the engine, be sure not to tighten down each individual bolt completely. Make sure to evenly tighten them down all together. Once I evenly hand tightened them down till they were snug, I used the socket wrench to tighten them a little bit more. Make sure not to over tighten the bolts, they do not need to be that tight. Just tighten them down till you can't tighten them anymore. Once I completely secured the oil filter housing, I then started securing the oil cooler back onto the oil filter housing. Next, I started securing the intake manifold back onto the engine. After I finished securing the intake manifold, I replaced the oil cooler gaskets that are on the top of the oil cooler connection. Then I connected the oil hoses back into the oil cooler. Then I secured the oil hoses and the oil cooler back together with the T30 bolt. Then I secured the hoses back in place with the clip that was removed at the very beginning. Lastly, you're going to want to reconnect any electrical connections that you may have disconnected during the process and secure the foam that was removed to get the intake manifold out of the way back in place, and any other miscellaneous things that you may have moved during the process. So now that everything is installed back in place, the last thing I did here was fill up the coolant reservoir with more coolant, since we lost quite a bit of coolant when we disconnected those coolant hoses. So I filled up my coolant reservoir with a 50-50 mixture of BMW coolant and distilled water. I filled it up to the max level and then loosened the bleeder screw to release any air that may have been trapped in there. Once you loosen the bleeder screw, you'll notice that the coolant will go back down again because it's releasing trapped air. Once the coolant stopped flowing down, I closed the bleeder screw and filled up the reservoir to the max level again. Next, I put the car through the actual bleeding process to bleed the cooling system of any trapped air throughout the entire system. To do this, you press the start button once without stepping on the brakes so the engine doesn't start. And then you're going to turn the air on the lowest setting with the highest temperature possible on both sides. And then you're going to step on the gas pedal for 10 seconds. After you press on the gas pedal for 10 seconds, you should hear the water pump activate and start flowing coolant throughout the system. You should be able to hear what sounds like fluid flowing through the coolant hoses. After about 10 minutes, the bleeding procedure should stop, and then I checked on the coolant level once again because it usually will go back down because it released trapped air. If it is down, you're going to want to fill it up to the max level once more. Now, the very last thing I did here to complete the entire process was reinstall the air intake. With the entire replacement complete now, I started the car to make sure everything ran and functioned normally. Alright guys, so now at this point we have finished the replacement of the oil filter housing gasket and the oil cooler gasket. One thing I want to note before I end the video here, one important thing to know, as I was doing research before I performed this replacement, there were some claims that some people experienced their engine seizing up after they got this replacement done at a shop or if they did it themselves. There was a couple people who says that their engine seized up after just driving for a bit after doing the replacement due to a spun rod bearing. As I dug deeper into the research, there wasn't really a concrete, like for sure 100% claim that the oil filter housing gasket was the cause of the spun rod bearing. So some people have been saying that when you do this replacement, you're supposed to prime the engine and crank it a few times before actually starting the car. Now, I didn't do it, as you just saw, one, because I couldn't figure out how to do it, and because there was plenty of people who were saying that they did this replacement and they didn't experience any problems. So from what I can see, more people say that they haven't experienced any problems than people who say they have experienced. So I just took the risk and not did it, and the car started up fine, as you saw. I still need to take it for a drive to make sure 100% that nothing will go wrong, and if something does, I definitely will announce that, obviously, because that's huge. I'm really hoping not. So that's one thing to note before you do this replacement, and just kind of think about it and gauge what you want to do in terms of when you're finishing up the replacement and if you want to prime it or not. So that about wraps up this video for the oil filter housing and oil cooler housing replacement. So if you have any comments or questions, as always, comment them down below, and I will also link down all the parts that I used in this video and some tools if you want to check those out. But I will catch you guys on the next one.